The political circus is gearing up for 2024. Meanwhile, Americans are suffering from the costs of the political elite. Join the Mises Institute at Fort Myers, Florida on November 4th for an event dedicated to the White House, the Fed, and the economy. We'll cut through the campaign rhetoric to look at the future of the U.S. economy, with a lineup including Bob Murphy, Patrick Newman, Jonathan Newman, and Murray Sabrin. Register now at Mises.org/FL23. Human Action Podcast listeners can receive a special $10 discount using promo code FL2023. Audience numbers for Mises Institute podcasts are going through the roof, and we want to thank our great listeners with a special deal. Per Byland's primer on Austrian economics, How to Think About the Economy, has become one of the best sellers in the Mises store, and we're giving it away for free to our podcast listeners. This short book is a great refresher for understanding proper economic logic, and also a perfect introduction to economics for friends and family. So get your free copy of How to Think About the Economy by visiting Mises.org/HAPodFree. That's HA like human action, pod free. This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Brian, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, Brian, you are always my go-to when it comes to discussing the work of economists who are outside the fold of the elect, as it were. And so the recent Nobel, and we're going to get people commenting. I know it's not really the Nobel Prize, folks. At this point, we've beaten that horse to death. The recent winner of the economics pseudo-Nobel Prize was Claudia Goldin, and I saw you had a nice thread on Twitter going through some of her contributions. So can you just, 30,000-foot view right now, explain who she is and what the award was for?
Yeah, so she won the award last week for her work on understanding of labor markets, particularly how women's labor market outcomes are affected by policies, by social norms, things like that. I think she's best thought of as a kind of a old style, and I mean that in a way that I love this style, old style economic historian. She uses econometrics, she uses archival work, she digs into a lot of different stuff, things that people thought were impossible to kind of measure and quantify. She finds data on these things and looks across countries, across time to, bring a very rich picture to economic history overall. But particularly, she's kind of focused in, and she won the prize for women's economic history. But she's also done stuff on the effects of slavery. I think her dissertation was on that under the famous Chicago economic historian Robert Fogel. She's done stuff on immigration, really, really wide-ranging. I think the thing that makes her unique, one, at the time she was really putting emphasis on women, because at the time a lot of people who were looking at labor markets were just like dropping women from the sample. They just wouldn't think about them and think we're only about men. Well, women are too complicated. We have to distinguish married women, non-married women. When they have kids, everything goes. And so, up through, let's say the 70s and 80s, it was very common to only talk about men and talk about the labor market as if it was just men. And so she has really been at the forefront. She won it alone, which is a unique thing in the last few decades. She won it alone for being at the forefront of this research program. Well,
probably they realized they couldn't possibly give it to her and a man at the same time. That
wouldn't have looked great, for sure. There was a lot of talk of her getting an award for economic history that she could have shared with other people, or maybe labor markets more generally. But yeah, if it's going to be a prize for women's labor market outcomes, it had to be her.
Okay, and besides my snarky joke there, just in terms of her work, you mean not just for the optics, but also she may have had co-authors here and there, but this was clearly like her research program?
Exactly, and she had co-authors on a lot of her big books, a lot of her big papers, including Lawrence Katz, who's another person that's put out as a possible winner. but this is really her area for sure. Optics aside, like this is her specialty. They would write papers together, yes, about women, but they'd also write, men and women labor market outcomes. But the real focus clearly is from her. I don't know if Lawrence Katz has written a paper on women specifically that's not with Claudia Goldin. Maybe that's true, but
okay. So at some point I do want to just give you the floor back and have you go through and like do some of her greatest hits. But I think at this point, just to make sure, I can imagine some of our viewers and what they're thinking right now. And so let me just let me speak on their behalf to you and then let you answer. So I can imagine some listeners thinking, oh my gosh, are we doing this thing again? That, yeah, I know the feminists are out there with their wage gap stuff and the women only make and whatever, the number goes up over time, but let's say it's whatever, 85 cents. What is the current one? Do you know? Just so
the last I heard, and I'm a theorist by training, so don't quote me on this, but I think 83 is the number that people throw around now.
Okay. So people will say right now, latest statistics, as of what this economic theorist said, is 80. The women in the United States earn, and that's U.S. is what you're saying there.
Yeah, U.S.
Women in the U.S. make 83 cents to the man's dollar, and so give me and now I'm still doing the hypothetical human action podcast listener saying, but this is ridiculous. I have seen people like Thomas Sowell and Walter Block and others debunk those statistics, and they do crazy stuff. Like they don't take account of the major that the person had. And in some cases, they might say it's a full-time worker, but they don't account for the fact that the full-time male workers actually per week work more hours than the female workers in general, and things like that. They don't do years on the job. And so when you start, or the riskiness of the men are coal miners and taxi cab drivers, you're more likely to get killed in those occupations. So even if you ignored everything else and just knew that certain risky occupations paid higher because of that right there would partly explain. So when you adjust for all these common sense, obvious things, the so-called wage gap doesn't completely go to zero, but you whittle away most of it. And so I don't even, why are we even having this conversation? So somebody got a Nobel Prize for that. So go ahead. Why don't you respond?
So there's a lot in there. I would say she didn't win the Nobel Prize for documenting the wage gap. They're trying to measure to find the best estimate of what it is today or what it was in 2000. Her work is much more big picture about how labor markets have changed, things like employment rates, labor force participation rates, the types of jobs. Like she's an economic historian, as I said. This is something that your listeners should love. She is doing economic history. She's not testing theories. Right, she's doing history. She's measuring stuff that happened in the past. Not saying that it's a fact of nature that can never be overcome. Not saying that it's something that means that therefore we need socialism or something. She's documenting differences across time, across genders, across different groups in things like their pay, things like their salary, so like hourly wage versus their total salary, things like labor force participation. So what she has done is like I said in a Twitter thread I had, that like it's hard to kind of boil down what it's for. Last year, two of the winners got it for one paper. They wrote down a model of bank runs, and we can argue about that, and you and I would have a wonderful conversation about that. But she has really got it for like a wide-ranging research program that doesn't kind of have that, like, this is the takeaway that you can bring up at a cocktail party and really impress people, or this is the snarky comment you can make on Twitter to respond to someone. Hers is a much broader approach. I think a better approach to how we think about different labor market outcomes. Now, I think people have a instinctual, your listeners, people that I interact with, sometimes have an instinctual repulsion to this discussion about gaps, because it's like an implicit idea that everything should be equal. And you referenced Sowell. I mean, I think Sowell is great on this, that people are just different. And I think Goldin would say the exact same thing. People are different. Like it's not like we want to use policy to force this number to be 1 instead of 83 or 100 instead of 83. but it's different, and people should be interested in how these differences arise, what's changed over time. I think one confusion I see in the discussion is that some people are either trying to make the number as big as possible for some political reason, other people are trying to make the number as small as possible for some political reason. And I think neither of those should be the way we go. We should be trying to find proper numbers for the question at hand. And the question at hand will be a big factor in kind of what is the right counterfactual. If you're just interested in what is the average salary of the average woman in the U.S. versus the average man in the U.S., that is just a number that you could be interested in. But again, this is not about policy or anything like that. That could be a number that you're interested in the same way that you may be interested in how 50-year-old salaries are different than 25-year-old salaries, because it tells you something about the labor market that you are interested in. Now, often we're not super interested in the 50-year-olds versus the 20-year-olds, because we're like, why is that an interesting comparison? Why, it's comparing apples to oranges in some important respect. And so therefore we try to do these controlling for variables and things like that to try to make a better apples to apples comparison. Okay, we're only going to look at graduates of a particular school. We're only going to look at people who are physics majors. We're only going to look at people who have not been married. And depending on how you slice the data, you get different outcomes. And one of the things that she has shown, again, it depends on exactly the subsample that you're looking at, but a very compelling paper on like just thinking through that the gap exists in an interesting way, the gap for a particular group, is they looked at, I forget who the co-authors were, they looked at graduates from the University of Chicago's MBA program, prestigious MBA program. So you'd think that men and women who got into the same program, graduated from the same program, maybe somewhat similar. I mean, there's other ways you can try to compare them. And they show that after graduation, men and women worked the same amount, their labor force participation was the same amount, their wages were the same amount, okay? So right after graduation from an MBA program, so it's not just from an undergrad, these are like more advanced people in their careers, and that the gap only arises in this very weird subsample, right? This isn't most of the population. Most of the population does not go to University of Chicago. But in this weird subsample, the gap appears after people have children. And women drop out of the labor market, men stay in the labor market the same amount, women's pay drops, okay, so on and so forth. Now that's a number you could be interested in measuring. Like, what is the relative pay difference of graduates of the University of Chicago, yada, 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 to fit that situation. It doesn't tell us anything about, how to improve women's outcomes in inner cities. It doesn't tell us anything about how to raise men's outcomes that don't graduate high school. It's just a number you could be interested in for getting a richer picture of labor markets overall. And I think that is what her work really does. And again, to circle back, it really depends on the question that you're interested in, and therefore whether you're kind of making the right comparison. Now, if you're interested in what would happen if we would somehow get more women to major in physics, that's a different question. And we want to know what is the relative pay difference of men and women in physics, maybe. Okay. But again, it's context dependent on the question at hand. And so I think broad discussions of the wage gap or the labor force participation gap, I don't get a lot out of them. I think it really depends on a particular question that we can then get into. What are the right comparisons? Should we compare only people who have been working full time or not? I don't know. It depends.
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot there. Maybe we can try to unpack that. So your example of the looking at MBA graduates from the University of Chicago, I remember Walter Block had a similar thing when he lectures on this topic. And he said, if you just look at never been married academics, and I don't remember what academic, if that means like you have a PhD, I don't remember exactly what he meant by academic, but clearly, a higher than a college degree, then women have an advantage. Like that, just looking at the population of people who are employed, if you're an academic who has never been married, then women on average make more than men. And that, I don't know if you've been on hiring committees, Brian, but that certainly lines up with my experience working at two different colleges, and to see, like, when we had to hire somebody, clearly the women applicants were given very strong attention just because that's just good for everybody. You know what I mean? And so the idea that there's some penalty that is in place right now for that, just purely because people don't like to hire women, or they don't think women are good workers or something like that clearly cannot be the major explanation of some of those gross figures. It just doesn't, and there's also all the other arguments, like supposing that were the case. This is the kind of thing too, I'll say, Brent, like people who just repeat those figures and to say, okay, well, you also believe with your worldview, like if someone who just thinks, oh, this is just rampant sexism, look at how much women get underpaid. And they'll even say for the same work. Like, that's the thing. They don't merely just say a statistic that's misleading. A lot of people will say that and then just flat out say women get paid 83 cents to the man's dollar for the same work. And so then I'll come along and say, well, geez, if we know that these, factory owners and business owners are so cutthroat that they're willing to, shut down jobs, shut down factories here and outsource them to India to take advantage of cheap labor, you'd think they could just fire all the men here and just replace them with women, and all of a sudden they just boosted their profit margin. They just cut their labor costs by 17%. Mm-hmm. Like, no one thought of that? Like that, or that's how much they hate women, and it's when you start putting like, and it's just, so it's kind of like, come on, this can't be as simplistic as what you're saying. So I guess, Brian, my question is, once someone does want to investigate and just purely curious, like you said, clearly in general, I imagine 50-year-olds make more than 25-year-olds, except for like the NFL. That's not going to be true. Right. But in other areas, and even that's interesting, right? To understand, well, why would that be? How come in many industries, 50-year-olds make more than 25-year-olds, but not in professional sports? And it's, so to go through those things, and it's interesting to see. And then probably 50-year-olds make more than 85-year-olds in most things, but maybe not in a few. And then you could say why. And it would be kind of silly to say, oh yeah, society in general doesn't like 25-year-olds and 85-year-olds. Like that, you know what I mean? Like, that's just too, so to understand the forces behind it, are you saying that Claudia Goldin's work is useful to if you did want to dive into a particular statistic and unpack it and kind of try to figure out what's driving this result, that her work would be pretty useful?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In particular, it's useful because it uses supply and demand, which I'm a big fan of, to make sense of these things. So you told the story of the employer who is, in a sense, overpaying for men. So why don't competitive pressures force it so that only employers who are willing to hire women are therefore going to make larger profits? Why doesn't the market completely push towards them? Well, as many of your listeners are going to be, fans of Austrian economics, there's a lot about things don't instantaneously adjust. Time matters. Previous investments matter. Asset specificity matters. It takes a while to build up capital. It takes a while to build up skills. And these things are going to be kind of what economists call frictions in the market. Frictions not in the sense that, like, the government can solve them. It's just a matter of fact that things don't instantaneously adjust. There are sexist people who can make enough profit to survive. There are racist people who can make enough profit to survive if they have other things going their way. And maybe those things are other policies. I mean, occupational licensing being one example of a supply restriction that may temper the sort of competitive effects that we imagine playing out. Like, I think there's a tension. It's easy to poke holes in the other side on this, but I think there's a tension in kind of the knee-jerk reaction that there's no such thing as a wage gap. Otherwise, you're saying that people, are losing money on purpose. Well, maybe that's true in a true free market, but I hear all the time that we don't live in a free market in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Like, there's lots of things that are in the way. That's the nature of real economies, that they're not these, there's lots of policies, good, bad, indifferent, that affect, maybe tip the scale one way or the other. And we should, be aware of that. In particular, Goldin's work, especially recent work, highlights that there's a big, what they call a non-linearity to payoff. Basically, if you are willing to work a ton of hours and work terrible times, be on call to go to Tokyo at a moment's notice, to be called into the office because of some emergency, you're going to get paid a lot. Okay. To be willing to work that much, you have to get, in exchange, you have to be paid a lot. And that's very nonlinear, which means that the people who work the most aren't just going to, if you work twice as many hours, you're not just going to take home twice as much pay. You're going to take up 3, 4, 5 times as much pay. Okay. Why does that exist? Why is that the nature of the labor market? Why is that the return to the way technology works? Is policy affecting that? Are there things that are, take doctors for instance? We all know that there are lots of policies in place that restrict new doctors entering. Okay, in response, you get an increase of demand for doctors. Supply can't respond, and the supply of the number of doctors can't respond to that increased demand. The only other, or one of the main other margins in which things can change is each doctor or some subset of doctors can work more hours, and they get paid a bunch more because of that. It doesn't lead us to free market, anti-free market conclusions. That's just like something worth studying. And you could imagine that these policies are putting the scale, putting a finger on the scale relative to some other policies, putting a finger on the scale towards things that men tend to, for a variety of reasons, choose to do more. None of my story has anything to do with discrimination, with sexism. It's just, as an observable fact, men tend to work super, super long hours more than women do. And if policies push it that way, okay, well, maybe we could think through what other policies would affect that to kind of reverse it and kind of even things out more.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you went through that stuff, because this is something too that would come up, not so much on the male-female alleged wage gap, but like between races, and that sometimes, I've had people, and you try to be real careful in how you say things and not stick your chin out and whatever, but still I have people come back like, oh, so you're just saying, black workers are lazy or something, I mean? And someone's talking to you like that on Twitter, obviously they're getting real emotional and they're trying to make it that anyone who disagrees with me is a bad person and a racist, as opposed to, and I'm, when I was trying to show it couldn't, it's too not simplistic to just say, any statistical discrepancy must be solely attributable to inherent bias and discrimination on the part of every single employer in the United States. Like, that just doesn't make any sense, and so, but then to come back and say, well, no, not in the way you're saying it, but it could be that government schools, or what are commonly called public schools, tend to be worse in areas that minorities live in. You know what I mean? And so that's not their fault. That's a historical thing, and that's something I could lay at the feet of the horribly mismanaged government school system, which if we had a free market in education, I don't think you'd see these get, yes, poor people would not have as good quality schools, but I don't think the gap would be like it is now, where some schools, your kids go in there, they might get shot. Mm-hmm. And so that's certainly, one thing you could bring up. So again, Brian, I'm agreeing with you that I don't think, sometimes I think there's a tendency for fans of the free market to just say, no, these disparities are all just because, they should go get a better education or work harder or something. It's their own fault, or their culture of their people, and that's why. End of story. And, that to the extent that, no, there's plenty of government interventions that are leading to this outcome. Since you're a free marketeer, you can focus on those too, and not make it just sound like, oh, it's, if you're not getting paid as much as your neighbor, it's 100% your fault.
Yeah, I think that there's an important aspect that you need to try to understand the data and the theories and the arguments, regardless of what you think will be the policy implications, because it doesn't always cut the way that it doesn't need to cut the way that kind of sometimes people push it. Like, if there's a wage gap, therefore we're going to implement some heavy-handed policy. If there's not a wage gap, then we'll let free markets, rip. I don't think either of those are going to happen. So we should be interested in understanding the world as it is in order to kind of make sense of it. I think the naive story on both sides, the naive, 83 cents on the dollar as some evidence of pure discrimination by employers is bad, and so is this could never exist because, once we control for enough stuff, which may be controlling for too much stuff, once we control for a lot of stuff, then this goes away. It depends on the question you want to ask. Like if you what's called over control or overfit, you could kind of explain away everything, and so you're really left with a kind of a case by case basis of what's relevant, and it's going to vary through time. And I think this is one of the interesting things about Goldin's work. Like, the reason that men and women in 2023 have different labor market outcomes is not the same as what it was in 1970 or 1920 or 1800. There are going to be different forces at play in each time period for different groups within those time periods as well, and it's worth understanding those things to try to eventually we want to maybe think about how to change policy, or maybe we want to think about how to improve our own decision making. Like, do we? I think if you look at Goldin's work, she has a lot of work. One particular big paper on the Quiet Revolution, which is about how just how people think about the possible jobs, how that changes the jobs that they end up pursuing. Like, if you don't consider it possible, it's 1920 and you're a woman, and because of policy reasons or social norms, you don't think it's possible that you can be a doctor, you're not going to be a doctor. You're not going to go to school to do all that. It's just not going to happen. Well, your thoughts about what your possible careers are is not set in stone. And so we can think about in our own lives, like, what are these kind of implicit barriers, explicit barriers, what exist at different times and different places. It's a rich, complex question, and kind of talking and I'm just even talking about the U.S. right now. Forget talking about cross-country comparisons. Like, it's a complicated question. We shouldn't shy away from that.
Yeah, you mentioned something there that I did want to come back to this point. I think it was this summer. It was either this summer or last summer. I think it was this summer. There were, I forget what happened. I think it might have been maybe Jordan Peterson or somebody, or maybe, no, I think it was Matt Walsh actually. Somehow did a thing on the male-female wage gap and was real dismissive of it. And then a bunch of academic economists and like econometricians and whatever were all just having a big chortle about this stupid Neanderthal right-winger who didn't understand the first thing about statistical analysis, and they're all making fun of him for ignoring colliders. And so I didn't, and I was trying to get in, like, what are you guys talking about? And then so somebody, that knew me and I don't know, I won't say his name because I don't know if he wants me to talk, but he was trying to give me like, well, it could be things like this where the big picture was to say, yes, you could control for certain things, but then depending on the scenario, maybe that's like being obtuse. Mm-hmm. And so the example he gave me, like, he did a little model and we were, arguing back and forth about it, but he was saying, suppose there is like raw, actual, unfounded discrimination, sexism against women, such that even if a man and a woman did literally the same, job performance, the man would get paid $100 and the woman would only get paid $98. Okay, so let's assume there's 2% just raw, like, what we mean is completely unfair discrimination for no other reason than just prejudice. Okay, now knowing that, if we then may have a model where there's different college majors, let's say, and some majors are harder to complete than others, like physics, it's hard to get a physics to get a certain, to get a 3.8 as a physics major is harder than to get a 3.8 as an English major. And now partly maybe why, if you have like a model of education, like a Brian Kaplan approach, where it's the whole point, not the whole point, but in terms of what you're going to get paid, it's just a signaling device and it's not really the content of what you're getting, that why you might choose a physics major is because that's going to give you higher pay down the road. And so in a sense, it's like there's this 2% tax that is levied on the women that the men don't face in terms of their future earning potential because of that raw sexism that we just stipulated at the outset. And that in turn might mean on the margin, a woman or, an 18-year-old or whatever entering college is less likely to major in physics than in English because, the benefits are truncated because of that implicit tax. And so then in practice, fewer women than would otherwise be the case major in physics, and then that itself contributes to the measured discrepancy in the male-female pay, so that it becomes bigger than 2%. And so they think it's, so therefore they're saying to control for all these things, and that's sort of missing the part of the point, because if it weren't for that 2% raw discrimination, then more girls would have gone into the harder sciences. And then, so anyway, that's one of the arguments I saw. So do you want to just comment on that whole train of thought?
This is what makes it a hard problem, because people are forward-looking, things take time, and you can't just do simple controls in the way that you can in like if you are actually an experimenter, then you could basically treat the controls as things that your levers that you're changing. But we're more often than not, especially in these types of questions about career, we're simply observers, and so we don't have the controls to just kind of turn one thing on, turn one thing off. We can't imagine turning on the discrimination without turning on the effect of which major people choose. And so these things are all intertwined. And so that's why we have to use a whole bunch of different evidence to try to, triangulate what we think is the most reasonable conclusion on all of these things. Now, yes, this is something you need to worry about. At the end of the day, it's a empirical matter of how big of a force this is relative to other things. So is it the case that this is why women aren't going into physics as much, or is it because of some other aspect of the job that they, physicists tend to work long hours, or people who take jobs of that? Like, there's a lot of other things that it could be. It doesn't need. That's one story. One reason that we should maybe be skeptical of the simple controlling for solution. But then, okay, it doesn't establish the other story. It means we need to dig deeper and think about these mechanisms. And again, Goldin's work is trying to get at that. It's using surveys. Surveys have their problems, of course, but using surveys about what types of jobs people think they could have, and that maybe gives us some information of like, are they going to be penalized? Are they not going to be penalized? Do people think they're going to be penalized? If people don't think that they're going to be penalized at all, or there's no like social, pressure that they would do to get out of those professions, then we can try to disentangle the different effects. Again, hard question. All of them are probably true, right? There is sexism by certain employers. There is favoritism by other employers. There's forces that push women out of certain fields. There's forces that push women into certain fields. It's not, again, it's both sides. I think the naive response isn't the right one, and it's a complicated issue. It's like, it's the, in a sense, it's trying to summarize all of labor markets. Because what is it? It is men's women. Can't talk. It is men's wages. We need to know something about men's wages. We need to know something about women's wages. And that is everyone. So we need to know. I'm not trying to take a stand on anything related to gender issues. Mm-hmm. But that's the market. And to properly measure all of those things, we need to know overall labor markets. And now we're trying to collapse it into one number. It's going to be let's try to summarize all labor markets into one number. It's going to be missing something. Whatever number you come up with, whether you come up with 83, you come up with 71, you come up with 100, it's going to be missing some details. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't lose sleep over that. That's why the world is interesting. That's why we need economic theory to help us sort through things. That's why there's more to learn, and why there's rewards to teaching us about this stuff, like a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I guess, so thank you, and I agree with what you're saying there. The reason I was intrigued by that particular approach that the guy who pulled me aside showed me was that, it's pretty standard in this area to say things like, I said this too, like when I wrote my politically incorrect guide to capitalism, I took on the male-female wage gap and went through some of the correction, the correcting for holding certain things constant. And then I acknowledged, I said, look, if you want to blame like a patriarchal worldview or something, you can, but the mechanism would not be employers looking at a male employee and a female, and they know full well that the female's going to deliver just as much to the bottom line, but they just refuse to pay her as much. I said, that really doesn't make sense as the primary fulcrum for this outcome, just because of competition. Like they would need to be not just a handful or even the majority of employers, but in any given industry, like every single last one of them. Because if there was just one major company, I was like, well, why doesn't Oprah hire all the women? Because she hates women too. Like it doesn't make sense. It's because again, you would just see in practice, then the one company that has their head on straight would have a lot of women working for them. If it really were the case that you get the same output, but not paying as much. So, but what I did say was, now if you want to say, but in our society, the expectation is that when there are kids, that the wife stays home and raises them, whereas the husband is the breadwinner. Well, then that attitude, which you can call sexist if you want, then I could see, that could make sense. So then the employers, because the women are getting paid less on average, is because they don't have as many years in the workforce, or the employer knows, a 24-year-old applying for a job and she's a woman and she's married. I bet you down the road she's going to come back and say, I need to take time off, or I can only work part-time now because I got to stay home with the kid. And so you're going to be less likely to want to bring her on and put all years of training into building up this employee that you hope gives you a stream of output. If there's a chance, this employee is more likely to bail out than the guy.
Yeah.
And so those sorts of things. But again, I was just trying to isolate and say, is it but what was I liked about the theoretical possibility about this implicit tax from the raw discrimination was that it wasn't just some general cultural attitude like, girls aren't good at science, you're supposed to go into, counseling and education and stuff and let the men handle physics. That would be one thing. But if instead it was more of a cost benefit, like, what are the rewards to me from majoring in physics versus English? And if it's raw sexism is affecting that, and that can then have like an amplification effect. That's why I thought that was kind of neat that it was like the raw sexism that multiplied back through the system. But even there, when I was talking to this guy, I was modeling it out with him and showing, but still using a regression analysis, even with his approach, it would still pop out. You could isolate and say the raw sexism is still 2%, even with his whole, you know what I mean? So in other words, we still could isolate using the standard regression analysis to control for these things. And then you could tell a story if you wanted to. But some of this other stuff is in turn, it feeds through. But anyway, so I'm just kind of giving some context.
I mean, this is why you need economic theory to work through these types of problems of what is a reasonable comparison and what is not. And then it's a question of whether the data matches, what the theory is. One of the problems is, like, suppose you want to test that. You think that that's the way the world works, this tax. Okay, but if it's through a different mechanism, you're going to be picking up other stuff that's not, that's not there. So again, it makes it a really hard question, and why boiling it down to one number makes it pretty difficult. And we can just throw on other complications. Suppose women don't know, this seems reasonable. Suppose when you're 18, you don't know whether you're going to want to have kids and want to stay at home with them, but you think there's a possibility. Well, that, so you choose to pick a job with this idea that you might stay at home eventually, or might want to, take some time off or have a more flexible schedule, right? It's not an either or. It could be, I'm going to work 32 hours versus 45 or whatever. But it turns out that once you get to be, that stage, you decide you don't want to take time off. Okay. But you've already invested in like a career path that with the possibility that you may make time off. So even there, you say, okay, we're only going to look at people who didn't have kids. Well, the fact that in their, what ultimately happened, they didn't have kids, doesn't tell us that the possibility that they may have wanted to have kids didn't affect them earlier on. And so you can't even compare necessarily, men without children to women without children, because ex ante, before they finalize that decision of whether to have kids or not, they may not know, and they may make different decisions. Again, it's a super hard question that anyone, I wish I had something more interesting to say, but like
me too.
Anyone who has
That's why I had you on.
Slam dunk story. But I think one of the things, to go back to your point in your book, which I think is helpful, is to, okay, here's a particular mechanism that a lot of people think is true, and here is a force in which it may not be true. It could be more complicated. It could be this implicit tax story, but I think by pushing forward on a particular theory of what happens, a particular theory of the way that causes this to arise, then we can start digging for data and theories on that particular theory. Because, okay, so suppose you think it's all through forget the tax aspect. You think it's all through employer discrimination at the end. Like, forget the investment switch majors, We could try to go out and whether this is through experiments, whether this is through data collection of other types, we could try to measure different industries, employer sexism along different dimensions, and then see, okay, does it correlate with what we think it should? Do industries where the employers have more sexist attitudes, is there a bigger wage gap? Maybe, but we can only when we say, okay, this is the mechanism in which we're interested in, can we then go to the data and say, does this correspond? If we're just talking overall gender wage gap, we're going to be talking about employer discrimination. We're going to be talking about societal pressures and how do we think about that. We're going to be smuggling in discussions about the way teachers respond to different genders. Like, it's all bundled up, and we can't. I don't get a lot out of that overall discussion. I just don't see what we're going to learn from, in general. Is it across time and place? Is it going to go away? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that societies differ in how they think about men and women and differences across genders. That's not I don't think a controversial point of view. Maybe that plays out in the data. Maybe it doesn't, about different wage gaps. Yeah.
Great stuff. And I think folks probably caught, but I am friends with Brian and was kidding about I wish he was more interesting. Or actually, I do wish you were more interesting, but you are well above the threshold for me being glad I invited you, put it that way. So you said something that reminded me when you were talking about it's really subtle things where just keeping their future options open, like maybe a woman who might want to have a bunch of kids, and so she goes down a career path where that's an option. But then even if she doesn't pull the trigger on that, then, and who could blame her, right? Like looking at the men online, I wouldn't want to get married with them either. And so then she, doesn't do that. So then even just controlling and looking back and saying, oh, women who, didn't get married or didn't have kids, they're not getting paid as much, so there could be things, it'd be hard to really tease out. You'd have to get inside their heads, and it'd be tricky. That reminded me when I got contacted by someone from The Daily Show when is it Noah Trevor? Am I saying the name right? Is that the guy who was hosting it for a while?
Was doing it, yeah. Until
so I think it was when he was the host, and so it wasn't him to reach. It was like one of their staffers, and he said, "Yeah, we're thinking of doing a segment on the male-female weight." Or no, it was paid family leave. That's what it was. And we scoured the web because we were interested to bring on somebody who disagreed with it, and yours was the only person we could find. And so the guy got me on the phone, he was pre-screening me because they couldn't believe who could possibly be against this. And I was trying to sell the guy because I wanted them to have me. I mean, I knew full well I'd go into Lion's Den, and it wasn't like I was going to convince him the point would be to trot me out. Get a load of this guy, Hey, the 1950s called, they want their attitude back. But it was just funny. And I was making the case to him that the primary losers of paid family leave would be married women who don't end up having kids. And he was just, what are you talking about? And I was explaining to him because in a sense, and I exaggerate. I said, well, what if the law said, if someone gets pregnant, if someone has kids and decides to exercise the exit option while they're working with you and they have kids, you have to buy them an SUV. Because after all, if you had a newborn, having an SUV would be convenient, to go get diapers and stuff from the store and whatever. So it'd be good to have an SUV. So the law says if any of your employees has their first baby, you as the employer have to give them a brand new SUV. And I was saying, that's like a ticking time bomb. So when you're hiring people on the front end, you would be very concerned to know, what's the chance this person's going to have a kid in the next 5 years or their first child? And I said, clearly that would penalize, 22-year-old married women who didn't yet have kids. Even if they didn't decide to have, they would be, they would have to be either they wouldn't want to hire them or they would pay them a lot less because of that possibility. And it was well, no, it would be illegal. You couldn't pay them. You couldn't just not hire them because they're 22-year-old women. That's illegal. And anyway, I just was not making headway with the guy, but it was just kind of funny that when I told him the primary losers would be women who chose not to have kids, but who could have had kids. He just didn't get what I was talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good encapsulation of the importance, again, of economic theory to think through, and common sense, true, but I mean, to think through the relative ways in which people will adjust, the way that people, like economics is all about incentives and how people respond. And okay, the policy isn't just in place and then that's the end of the world. You're pointing out, which I think is the right way to go, you're pointing out that there are all these ways in which people will respond to it. It doesn't always cut the way that you want, and it's a difficult. We can look back at different times and see, again, we can do economic history. We can see times in which policies favored leave recently and adjustments and see how employers responded, how workers responded. It's never going to be this kind of clean experiment that we would hope it would be. We can think through these things. But let's also remember that like a lot of these things are not policy driven. Policy plays a huge role. There's tons of policy intervention that affects the way the labor market works. But there are things that are not because the government told you to do it. Companies are introducing leave not because they're being forced by the government. They're jumping ahead of that. Okay, what are the effects of that? We can study that. Does it affect within that? It's a different question because we're kind of looking company by company or groups of companies. But does that affect trajectory of labor outcomes going forward by allowing this flexibility? Again, maybe it narrows some gap, maybe it widens other gaps. I don't know. We can look at these things, and there's lots of variation out there in the world. Again, for the more empirically minded than I am, there's lots of variation out there in the world to see when things cut one way versus when they cut another way.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So to be clear, folks, I wasn't against paid family leave. I was against the government mandating that all companies, above a certain number of employees, which is what the issue was. Because the talking point at the time was the U.S. is the only major industrialized country that doesn't have this. How could anyone? And they looked high and low, and I was the one guy they could find that was making an argument against it. Okay,
I moved. A big perk of moving to my current job is I got some family leave some paid leave for my second kid, and like that's a free market response to trying to attract me away from tenure, tenure track position, right? So markets adjust to these things and people respond. It'll be interesting with how work from home changes, how people care about flexibility and time off and stuff like that. But these things are constantly evolving, and I think one of Goldin's interesting things is to show that they're constantly evolving. To not kind of sit at any time period and kind of judge it as good or bad or who do you blame, but like these things are changing over time, and different people will take different forces will be at play at different time periods. Like again, the reason that if there's a gap, depending on how you measure it, the reason it exists today is not going to be the same as why it existed 100 years ago.
Okay, I unfortunately have a hard stop in 2 minutes. So, Brian, what would you say? Like, someone's listening, they're intrigued. Can you maybe give a guide, like to say, all right, if you want to read Claudia Goldin's work, start with this, and then if you like that, then try to can you give a little bit of guidance of a map of the terrain?
Yeah, so she's done a lot of interviews over the years. If you want to listen to podcast interviews, she's done those. People, your listeners might be aware of Tyler Cowen. He's got an interesting podcast with her. Podcasts are easy. into topics. That's why we're here discussing that. On her own writing, she's actually, because she's an economic historian, she writes books, and books tend to be easier to read than academic articles. So I forget the order of them, but her most recent book is on like family and related to that. So that's an interesting one to get into. She has just if you're interested in kind of a very particular aspect of this, I think her paper with Lawrence Katz on the pill is interesting. I forget the title of it. It's in my thread, but if you search Claudia Goldin, the pill, it's tracing out the effect of the pill on women's labor market outcomes. Again, because it changes, just circle back, like why it's a super interesting example. Suppose instead of deciding to have kids or not, you just don't have control over that. You don't know. Well, that's going to affect how big of an investment you're going to make. Are you going to try to get the big partner job, knowing that you don't have an idea of whether you'll get pregnant in 3 years, and therefore you'd have to leave?
Brian, do you know where babies come from?
Do
we need to have a second installment that maybe we'll put a little disclaimer at the front for?
So that would be a unique one. I've seen a fair amount of Human Action podcasts. I think that would make a unique one. But,
we're living up to the name of the podcast.
But yeah, so that's a good. It's an academic paper, so beware of that. But I think the intro and stuff gives you a good sense. But I would start with the books if people want to read.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so folks, we'll put links to that. I'll find the Tyler Cowan's interview with her and that article, and then a link to a book or so forth. Okay, well, unfortunately, I need to wrap this up. Thank you. So, folks, my guest this week has been Brian Albrecht. Brian, thanks again for your time.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.